Hello, everybody, and welcome again. We're still talking about American history since 1945, as we will do for the next few videos. So, anyway, what I want to talk about today is the end. We are at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Reagan years. Suddenly, without warning, uh, the Cold War just ended for what seemed from the American perspective, to come from out of nowhere. And so what I want to do today is talk a bit about the end of the Cold War, but I want to do it from the Soviet perspective instead of from the American perspective. We've been talking all along here about the American side of the Cold War. Today I'm basically going to trace the history of the Cold War from the Soviet perspective so that we can see how the Soviet Union became this threat that the Americans thought existed, and then also talk about why the Soviet Union collapsed. Because from the Soviet perspective, we can actually see the collapse coming a long time before the Americans could see it. So I want to talk very briefly, very quickly about kind of the history of the Soviet Union from its founding through its collapse in the late 80s and early 90s. Now, a lot of the events I'm going to talk about here, we've actually already touched on before in other videos and in the various course readings and all of that, so I'm not going to go into very much detail about a lot of these events. I just want to give you the Soviet perspective on the events that we've already been talking about here. And so when I'm doing this, I'm going to be presenting this from the Soviet perspective. And so whenever I say we in this particular video, I'm talking about we as in we the Soviets. I'm not, usually in other videos I've been talking about we as Americans because I've been presenting things from the American perspective, but this time it's all going to be about the Soviet perspective. And so when I say that we did this, I'm talking about the Soviets did this. When I say they, I'm usually going to be talking about the Americans, because the Americans in this case are the outsider. So I'm going to skim through a whole bunch of different decades here, but hopefully I want to give you kind of the big picture of what this Cold War was like for the Soviet Union. And so to start, we've been looking at it from the American perspective, which has always made it look like the Soviet Union is this massive threat kind of on the horizon that is on the verge of taking over the world. And that's definitely the image of the Cold War that the American government was invested in presenting, that a lot of American policymakers were invested in getting out there. Today we're going to look at it from kind of the other perspective, from the Soviet perspective, which was basically the same perspective, you just swapped the players. From the Soviet perspective, the United States was on the verge of taking over the world and threatening the existence of the Soviet Union. The Americans, we liked to think, there I go, I was falling into we for the Americans. The Americans liked to think that the Soviet Union was this massive threat that is an existential threat that is there to destroy the United States. The Soviets had the exact same perspective, that the Americans were there to destroy the Soviet Union. And so I want to focus on what the Soviets' view of all of these activities and events of the Cold War was. First, very quickly, Imperial Russia, before it became the Soviet Union, was a conglomeration of a whole bunch of different people. The land mass that made up the Soviet Union is huge. I mean, it covers most of the continent of Asia, which means there are massive deposits of natural resources. There are dozens, hundreds, probably even thousands of different languages being spoken across northern Asia. And so the expansion of the Russian Empire from the 15th century up until the 20th century was one where there were very powerful people in the core areas, like in Moscow, who were expanding into other territories, mainly as a way to seize resources and to seize territory. The most famous kind of leaders of this expansion were Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Living in the 17th and 18th centuries, they were responsible for the expansion of Russia into most of what is modern day Russia and the Soviet Union, which spread all the way from Eastern Europe all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, which covers somewhere, if I'm doing the math right, around 11 time zones. It is a massive chunk of land, encompassing a lot of different people and a lot of different resources. The Soviet Union is actually a very rich country when it comes to resources. However, the Soviet Union was not good at building an infrastructure that was necessary to distribute those resources to everybody else across the country. Now, so that's a problem for Russia throughout its history. The other issue that Russia faced was that people like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, they desperately wanted to be taken seriously as great world leaders. And so Peter the Great especially wanted to build a Western-style country in Russia. And so he even, he moved the government from the city of Moscow to the new city of St. Petersburg, which was built kind of using European models and European architecture, because he wanted to create a country that looked like a European nation. He wanted the wealth. He was emulating the wealth that European nations had. He wanted the industrialization that European countries were kind of doing in this period. And Catherine the Great kind of wanted to replicate that too. And so the Soviet, the Soviet Union, which inherited this tradition from the earlier Russian governments of wanting to be like the West, but they don't quite have the cash or the ability to capitalize on their resources the way those other European countries did. The other European countries were much smaller, and it was much easier to unite those other smaller countries of Western Europe by railroads or by roads. It's very difficult to unite all of Russia by railroads and all that. There is a Trans-Siberian Railroad that's built at one point, which is something like 4,000 miles long, and it takes 2 weeks to get from one end of the country to the other. So you can move stuff around, but it's very slow. It's very arduous, and it's only the areas that are connected by that railroad. There are vast swaths of Russia and later the Soviet Union which are never connected to railroads. And so there's always going to be this inability to move stuff around, and that's going to be a huge problem for these guys. So that Imperial Russia was trying to industrialize, trying to modernize. It was also doing it on the backs of a slave class that were called the serfs. And that created a whole lot of resentment, and eventually that whole system blew up in what we now know as the Russian Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution, where the people lower on the org chart in Russia decided they wanted to overthrow the people at the top of the org chart and instate some new system of government where the little guy will rule. And so they seized onto these 19th century's ideas of people like Karl Marx and all of that, who argued that the revolution will bring about a utopian culture where everybody benefits equally from modernization, from industrialization. It won't be just the rich versus the poor, the few versus the many. Everybody will benefit from it. And this was a very appealing message to people who had been traditionally downtrodden in Russia. And so the Russian Revolution was that idea trying to come to fruition. The idea that we can build an egalitarian culture. We can build an egalitarian country where everybody shares in the profits. Everybody shares in the labor, but also shares in the profits. And now we've talked in previous lectures about how communism as it came to exist in the Soviet Union doesn't really look much like the communism that had existed on paper back in the Karl Marx days and all of that. I think that was in one of the very first lectures I did on America since 1945. So it's not going to look like the result isn't going to look like what everyone hoped for. But putting that aside, at the time, in the 19-teens, 1920s, this was a very idealistic era when it looked like there was a possibility of truly leveling the playing field for everybody. And there were instances where the Western capitalist powers fought against that. Like the American intervention in 1917, in the middle of World War I, when the new Bolshevik government was withdrawing from the war effort in World War I, the Americans launched an intervention to try to temper the Bolshevik Revolution, possibly even reverse it. It didn't work, and those Americans ended up leaving pretty quickly. But the Americans did try to step in to stop this revolution. The glorious revolution that people liked because it was going to bring about a leveling and a kind of equality to the country that hadn't existed before. So, right off the bat, we Soviets have a little bit of a grudge against the United States and all of those other Western European powers. The Western European powers were capitalist. The Western European powers were built on inequality. They were built on class structures. And so when we Soviets are trying to figure out who are we and who are we against, well, we're against the Western capitalist powers. The Western capitalists, they create the authoritarian governments, like in Germany, they create monarchies. We Soviets just overthrew our monarchy, so we are truly a democratic system, ideologically anyway. As we know, it's not going to play out that way, but so the idea is there early on that we are pitted against the Western imperialist powers, the Western imperialist dictators. And so when in the 1920s, the Soviet economy started to boom, because, again, the Soviets kind of continued with that crash industrialization scheme that earlier Russian leaders had tried to do. The Soviets followed through on that. And so the Soviets quickly started building factories. They quickly started putting people to work in factories. They started moving people around the country so that they would work in agriculture versus in manufacturing. Sometimes they would switch them. People who had a long agricultural history are now going to work in factories. It was a really weird kind of tumultuous and chaotic moment, but it did create a boom time in the 1920s and the 1930s. Much of it was led by this guy, Vladimir Lenin, who was one of the leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution. He had a whole bunch of plans, which he called the New Economic Policy, where we, being the Soviet Union, are going to kind of launch this crash course in industrialization. And in doing so, we will be able to rival the economic power of those corrupt Western capitalist dictatorships. And so the Soviet Union launched a bunch of campaigns where we started moving people around, putting people to work in factories. It looked like the world was our oyster until Lenin died in 1924. That kind of cut short that new economic policy. It kind of cut short kind of a lot of the optimism that people were feeling about the communist revolution, because as soon as he died, of course, his two lieutenants that were right below him basically went to war with each other. A guy named Leon Trotsky and a guy named Joseph Stalin went to started struggling against each other to figure out who's going to kind of take control of the Communist Party and the new Soviet Union in the wake of Lenin's demise. Trotsky ends up getting assassinated in Mexico City, and so Joseph Stalin wins that fight, and Stalin becomes the new leader of the Soviet Union after Lenin's death. And Stalin kind of continues the policies put in place by Lenin, which involved, looking at it from an outside perspective, isn't very good. Forced collectivization, forced industrialization, a whole lot of repression. You're not allowing people to criticize the government. There's all kinds of instances where people who became problematic from Stalin's perspective were literally just erased from history. And then there were millions of people that were sent, an unknown number, but somewhere in the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people that were just disappeared, that were kind of called out as being troublemakers, and a lot of them got exiled to places like these camps in Siberia and Siberian gulags. So a lot of them were just outright executed for theoretically crimes against the revolution, for being counter-revolutionaries. A lot of them were not actually guilty of doing that. A lot of them were just turned in by their by nosy neighbors and stuff like that. But so there were definitely some growing pains from the Soviet perspective in the 1920s and 1930s. But all those factories were booming. There was a lot of stuff coming out of those factories, a lot of people being put to work, and so the Soviet Union was like the one shining economic entity during the 1930s, when the rest of the world was falling apart in a global depression. All those capitalist countries of Western Europe and the United States and all of their various colonies around the world, those places were starting to collapse financially, but the Soviet Union was booming. And a lot of it was at the end of a barrel of a gun, but it was still booming. And so, from the Soviet perspective, we're doing pretty good here. And from a lot of people around the world who were not in the Soviet Union, but other countries around the world, there were a lot of people in those other countries that pointed to the Soviet Union as saying, wow, maybe they've got their stuff together. Maybe maybe that's the way to go. And so a lot of people around the world saw the Soviet success, and just a lot of people thought maybe we should replicate that here. And so we start to see communist movements start popping up around the world. A lot of that was led by the Communist International, which was a organization established by the Soviet Union to serve as kind of the clearinghouse for communist propaganda, but would also serve as kind of the front organization for organizing all of those communist entities around the world. And so the Communist International became a very kind of a powerful organization in the Soviet Union and elsewhere, because a lot of people looked to the communists as a potential solution to the Great Depression. And so in the 1930s, we see the economic crisis hitting those corrupt Western capitalist powers versus what seems like a lot of great industrial success at home in the Soviet Union. A lot of that success is inflated. The Soviet factories were churning out a lot of stuff, but a lot of it was inferior stuff. They were churning out a lot of steel that people wouldn't actually use because it would bend and break. They churned out a lot of shoes that people wouldn't wear because they were uncomfortable. But if you're gauging your economic success by the sheer volume of stuff that's being produced by factories, it's looking really good for the Soviet Union during the 1920s and the 1930s. Now, those corrupt capitalist countries in Western Europe, their response to the Depression of the 1930s is to start going even more authoritarian and more corrupt and more capitalist than they even had before. And so you've got the rise of authoritarian dictatorships in places like Germany and in Italy, which are built on a nationalist sentiment. I've been talking before, when I was talking about the ideology of communism in many videos ago, one of the core beliefs and the core principles of communism is that there is no nation. Everybody is united in this in this struggle for survival and all of that. So there is no nation state under true communism. Fascism, though, is based on the greatness of the nation. It's based on nationalism. And so communism and fascism do not mix at all. And so when people like Hitler come to power, now Hitler and even Mussolini and other various fascist type folks throughout Europe, they started to call themselves socialist. I mean, the Nazi Party was known as the National Socialists. They were not actually socialists, though. They used the name because it was very popular. As I just mentioned, the Soviet Union looked like it had its stuff together. And so socialism was not a dirty word. Socialism was actually something that a lot of people aspired to. And so it's not too surprising that the National Socialists call themselves socialists. They didn't actually believe in any socialist stuff. And when Hitler came to power, and when the Nazi Party actually started to gain some power and started to purge itself of people it didn't like, some of the first people to go were the actual socialists. There were a lot of German socialists who joined the Nazi Party thinking that that was going to be a home for them, a political home for them in Germany. But no, they all got kicked out. A lot of them got lined up and shot. And so the socialists were very quickly expelled from the Nazi Party. And so we have the development instead of this far-right nationalist dictatorships in Germany and in Italy, and starting to kind of take root in other places throughout Europe. And so from the Soviet perspective, this is bad. We've got people who are anti-communist, who are the exact opposite of us, who are coming to power, and they're building massive armies, and what are they going to do with it? And so when Hitler builds these massive armies and starts to march those armies across Europe, the first nation to raise the alarm is the Soviet Union, because we see where they're going. I mean, 20 years earlier, 25 years earlier, we were in the middle of World War I when the Germans had invaded Russia. And the Germans are now on the march again. They're taking the Rhineland. They're taking Austria. They're taking the Sudetenland. They're taking Czechoslovakia. They're marching west. And the Soviets realize that what's happening, and they start to put the call out to all the other Western powers. Hey, this is dangerous. Remember World War I, the Great War, when these guys were on the march? They're on the march again. What is the rest of the world going to do to stop it? The Soviets can't stop it on their own. The Soviets are still playing catch-up on industrialization and all that. Sure, there's a booming economy, but, you know, it's still all relative at this point. So the Soviets can't stop the Nazis themselves. They can't stop Germany themselves. They start to call out to Britain and France and the United States. Everybody, hey, come help us out. The problem, though, is that those other European countries are not interested in getting involved in another war right now. The French are cowering behind that Maginot Line, which they thought was going to stop the Germans. And I don't want to say cowering as in they were cowards, but the French had suffered very much under World War I, and they didn't want to see that bloodshed happen again. So it's not that they were cowardly, it's just that they did not believe that, you know, the Germans marching through Czechoslovakia, that's not worth another round of bloodshed like we had seen during the Great War. The British kind of felt the same way. We didn't want to go through that all over again. And so there was kind of a desire among those Western European countries to start bargaining with Hitler. And so that brings us to the Munich conference, where after the Germans invaded Czechoslovakia, the British engaged in kind of an appeasement policy where they said to the Germans that, you know, you can keep what you have, just please don't go any farther because we don't want to get into a war with you. And when the British appeased the Germans, and the French refused to get involved because they didn't want the bloodshed. And the Americans refused to get involved because of, the America First neutrality law mentality that was gripping a lot of American politicians in the 1930s. The Soviets realized we're kind of on our own here. And so in 1939, we Soviets signed an agreement with the Germans pledging not to go to war with each other as long as Germany respected its current holdings. If the Germans continue to expand eastward into Poland, all right, then there's going to be a problem. But as long as the Germans stay out of Poland, we will not go to war. Because again, we couldn't depend on anybody else. None of the rest of the European powers were interested in helping. And then the British also signed a separate agreement with the Germans, where if they don't invade Poland, the French made an agreement. Okay, yeah, Poland is kind of the buffer state here. So as long as Poland stays intact, everything's going to be fine. We're not going to interfere with German expansion. Hitler, though, was not of necessarily very sound mind, and so in 1939 he decided to invade Poland, which of course voided all of those agreements. The British then reluctantly got dragged into the war. The Americans stayed out of it. They were never a signatory to the Poland thing. The Americans aren't going to get in until Pearl Harbor, but there's a lot of people in the United States that realize that war is on the horizon and war is pretty much going to happen. It's pretty much inevitable. But, and when Germany invades Poland, that violates the Nazi-Soviet pact. And so now the Soviet Union has to go to war with Germany. Germany then invades France and knocks it out completely, instates a friendly government, starts bombing Britain, and starts to plan for an invasion of the Soviet Union. And so the Great Patriotic War, which is the Soviet name for World War II, is on. And it was something that the Soviet Union had not wanted to happen, but it happened. And from the Soviet perspective, it happened because of Western European powers refusing to stop it from happening and refusing to help them when they possibly could have had an easier time of it. And so those corrupt Western capitalist dictatorships that we've been talking about, they're just tarnished that much more now from the Soviet perspective. And then you've got people like the Americans, like Harry S. Truman, giving quotes about if we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia. And if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible. Although I don't want to see Hitler victorious under any circumstances. Neither of them thinks anything of their pledged word. And so we've already got the Americans refusing to get involved. You've got Americans like Harry S. Truman, who is going to very soon become the vice president of the United States, saying that the Russians and that the Soviets and the Germans should bleed each other for a while. That's pretty upsetting from the Soviet perspective. And so, yeah, we still want the Americans to come into the war, but boy, they're wearing out their welcome with the Soviet Union very, very quickly. And then, once Pearl Harbor happens and the Americans get dragged into the war, the Soviets plead with the Americans to launch an immediate invasion of mainland Europe to help to lessen the pressure on the Soviet Western Front here in what was known as the German Eastern Front in Eastern Europe. The Soviets wanted the Americans to come in quickly to alleviate the pressure, and then that way everybody could work together. But as we know, the United States, the Americans decided to spend 2 years tinkering around in peripheral areas like in northern Africa and in Albania and Greece and in Italy. It took them 2-3 years almost to actually get to get to the invasion of D-Day at Normandy in June of 1944. So from the Soviet perspective, the Americans are following through on Truman's request to let them bleed each other. And so the Soviets are losing people by the thousands by the day, as we will see here in a few minutes. So the Soviets were very suspicious of the Americans already, and then the Americans' actions during World War II made them even more suspicious from the Soviet perspective. At the meeting in Yalta, the United States agreed to allow the Soviet Union to enter the Pacific theater once the European theater came to an end, and with the idea that the Soviets and the Americans would then get to divide up that former Japanese territory and hold it under their own spheres of influence. So the Americans and the Soviets are going to work together to defeat the Japanese once the Germans get knocked out of the war. And by this point in 1944, the writing's pretty much on the wall. So they know that the war is going to end pretty soon in Europe. Let's work out Japan. And Japan is the Japanese holdings. We will divide that up. And so that from the Soviet perspective, they also got Eastern Europe. Europe at this point is a sphere of influence. But the Soviets, we believe that the future is going to get even brighter once we join with the Americans to go fight against the Japanese. That's scheduled to happen in September of 1945. That doesn't happen because in August of 1945, the Americans dropped their 2 atomic bombs. Now, this is important. From the Soviet perspective, this is absolutely reprehensible. These weapons are insane. These weapons are, and they are beyond the pale because they are indiscriminate in their killing. The Americans must be insane if they're willing to use weapons like this on civilian populations. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there were some military installations there, but those were civilian cities. And the idea that Americans were so bloodthirsty that they would drop atomic bombs on cities and kill hundreds of thousands of civilians was utterly incomprehensible to the Soviet Union. There's also, of course, a racial aspect to that. How long had the Americans been discriminating against Japanese and Chinese people? Now, you could go all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Acts of the 1890s. You could even go back to, in California, the foreign miners' taxes of the 1840s even. The Americans had been discriminating against Chinese and Japanese people for decades, for a century in some cases. And so the idea that the Americans are fully comfortable with dropping atomic bombs and obliterating entire cities of these people, from the Soviet perspective, was insane, and it was also indicative of some serious racism. Because again, this is the era Jim Crow still exists, so the Soviets, Americans are repressing black people at home, and they're also annihilating Asians by the hundreds of thousands. And so from the Soviet perspective, from the moral perspective, this is obscene what the Americans have just done. And so it demonstrates to the Soviets that, oh my God, the Americans are bloodthirsty, and they do not have any qualms about destroying their enemies regardless of military capabilities and all of that. And then that doesn't even take into account the disappointment of not being able to participate in the Pacific Theater, and also split up some of the sphere of influence that they had been promised back at Yalta. And so the Soviets, we are very, very upset with this nuclear detonation. Now, it wasn't a total surprise, as we all know. I mean, our government knew about it. Stalin had spies in the Manhattan Project, and so we knew it was coming. But the vast majority of Soviet citizens didn't know that until it actually happened. And the Soviet government was able to put together some very dramatic propaganda about how bloodthirsty the Americans are and how willing they are to completely annihilate people that they see as the enemy. Now, the Americans tried to justify the atomic bombings by saying that they were saving lives, because an invasion of Tokyo and an invasion of the Japanese home islands would have cost tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million American lives. And so their justification for the atomic bombs was that we were saving all those lives. From the Soviet perspective, 100,000, maybe even 1 million lives, that's nothing. The Soviet Union lost somewhere on the order of between 20 and 25 million people in the Great Patriotic War, aka World War II, which is 14% of the population. 1 in 7 Soviet citizens was dead as a result of World War II. That's including military and civilian. And that does not include injured casualties. That is purely just the dead. And so the Soviet Union, when they hear Americans complain about possibly 100,000 dead soldiers, the Soviet Union shakes its head and thinks, wow, that's like a Tuesday for us. I mean, the United States in World War II, the entire United States lost 400,000 people, which is a lot for the United States. I don't want to downplay that. But when you compare that to 25 million people dead in the Soviet Union, the Americans got off very, very easy in that war. Less than 1/3 of 1% of the American population was dead as a result of World War II. 14% almost of the Soviet civilization population was dead as a result of World War II. I mean, just in the one Battle of Stalingrad, the Soviets lost over 1 million guys. So the idea, and this was just in one battle that was fought as a holding action to prevent the further invasion of German forces into the Soviet Union. And so the idea that the Americans might lose 100,000 guys as in the process of totally ending the war, well, that seems utterly ridiculous to the Soviets. The Soviets think that the Americans are they're obviously the Americans think more of white American lives than they do of, Asian lives. So the Soviets have a very big propaganda card to play here as a result of American actions during World War II. Now, after World War II, of course, the Soviet Union is going to start to rebuild. The Soviet Union is going to it's going to take a long time. The Soviet Union, as I just mentioned, lost 25 million people. It's going to take a long time to recover from that. Most of the Soviet and the old Russian industrial base was built along the western edge of the Soviet Union, which is the area that the Germans had marched through, and the Germans had largely leveled everything they came into contact with. And so much of the Soviets' industrial base and a lot of their population are gone after World War II. And so the next decade or so is going to be about the Soviets rebuilding. And we're going to, as we rebuild, of course, we're going to start looking for scapegoats, as humanity tends to do. And Stalin and the Soviet leadership decided that the most obvious people to blame for this are Western capitalists. They had brought the war on. Hitler and Mussolini had been capitalists, fascist capitalists, but capitalists. And the United States had been capitalist, and the United States had allowed the Soviets to bleed for a long time. The British were capitalists. All of these corrupt Western democratic capitalist corrupt nations had brought on the war. And so it shouldn't be too much of a leap for Stalin and others to start saying that basically just repeating that to the people and saying that that was a war between capitalism and communism. And so therefore we need to prevent that from happening again by being as, defensive and as, proactive as possible to prevent that from ever happening again, because that was hugely traumatic. And so when Western powers like Winston Churchill start talking about this Iron Curtain and how they're going to be dividing up the world between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, from the Soviet perspective, this is a threat. Because again, we're being walled off from the rest of the world. When you draw a wall around Soviet-controlled territory, there's a lot of stuff outside that territory that starts to look like the Western powers are starting to encircle the Soviet Union. And if we Soviets allow the Western powers to completely surround us, that's going to lead to our ultimate demise. And so stuff like the Iron Curtain speech is a indication that there's trouble on the horizon, that the Western powers are starting to draw lines, and that's not going to turn out well, especially with how powerful those Western powers were after World War II. And so when you've got incidents like Nikolai Novikov, who was a Soviet agent in the United States, sending back that long telegram that we've talked about before, where he talked about American capabilities and American intentions. It's not too much of a leap to start thinking that the Americans want to take over the world. They're bloodthirsty, they're racist, and they have the capability to do it. And so why wouldn't they? And so the Soviets see this, the beginning of the Cold War, as an existential crisis, much like the Americans did, but this is from the Soviet perspective here. And then the Americans start building a permanent wartime government bureaucracy through the National Security Act. They start building things like the Central Intelligence Agency, National Security Agency. They start building they start building up the size of their militaries. They break the Air Force off from the Army and start building new divisions of the military. And so after every other war, American military spending and all that had gone down, but in this case, American military spending is not going down. And so this just looks more like they've got the capabilities and the intentions to do bad things from the Soviet perspective. The Berlin Airlift was kind of the first major incident between the two sides when we Soviets, because we held on to Eastern Europe and East Germany, it didn't seem too unreasonable for us to ask to also control Berlin, which is actually located in East Germany. And so from our perspective, it wasn't that big a deal to call on the Western powers to hand over West Berlin to us so that we could kind of solidify our control. And the Western powers said no, and they brought us to the brink of war by airlifting in supplies to West Berlin. And eventually, we graciously allowed the Western powers to continue to hold on to West Berlin, but this is just a sign that there's a lot of tension out there and a lot of danger still to come. In response to the Americans creating a military alliance in 1949 called NATO, the Soviet and our satellite countries created a similar military alliance in 1956 called the Warsaw Pact, because the Americans and the Western Europeans, as you can see on this map here, are starting to totally encircle the Soviet Union. They've got NATO members all the way from Norway on the Soviet Union's northern border, through West Germany on the western border, all the way through Turkey on the southern border. And the expansion of NATO's roster indicates that that's just going to continue to proceed. And so the Soviet Union we need to do something to stop this encirclement as we're starting to see it. Because the Americans are starting to engage in a lot of dangerous activities. Thankfully, in 1949, we Soviets were able to light off our own atomic bomb, demonstrate to the Americans that they're not the only ones that have this power, and so we will stand up to you if necessary. Thankfully, also in that same year, China, the world's most populous country, directly to our south, The Civil War there ended with a communist victory, which gave a huge boost in morale to the Soviet Union, because now we've got, somewhere on the order of 1 billion new communist adherents in a very large, very powerful country directly to our south. And so we end up with a very large block of communist countries in Asia, which is going to make it that much more difficult for the Americans to encircle us. So this is a good thing. Now, we're going to see some problems later, because the Chinese, their vision of communism is a bit different from the Russian version of communism, from the Soviet version of communism, so there's going to actually be a whole lot of tension there. But for now, we're going to focus on the idea that this is a good development, because now it's going to be that much harder for the Western powers to surround us and to crush us. Now, in 1952, our beloved leader, Joseph Stalin, died. Luckily, that didn't quite spark a bloody civil war like Lenin's death had. But the new guy in charge, Leonid Khrushchev, was a bit more of he wasn't quite the bloody dictator that Stalin was, and Khrushchev actually launched what he called a de-Stalinization campaign, where he tried to eliminate a lot of the excesses of the Stalin years, try to cut down on some of the repression, cut down on some of the forced collectivization, try to, we're not going to abandon communism by any means, we're not going to embrace capitalism or anything like that, we're still going to keep that alive, but try to make the Soviet Union a bit more friendly and a bit more bearable. And during his years, we've got some dramatic moments and some dramatic victories, like the space race. We launched the humanity's first artificial satellite into space with Sputnik, which sparks panic in the United States, rightfully sparks panic in the United States. It kind of opens up a glorious new future for the Soviet Union, where even if we're surrounded by enemies here on Earth, we can expand into the stars, and we can expand our civilization in 3 dimensions rather than in 2 dimensions. And so we have successes in launching the dog into space and Yuri Gagarin into space. Well, the dog success was a little bit mixed, but whatever. But we send a human into space, and so there's the future is open to us here, that there's kind of a glorious future where the Soviet Union can expand its influence into the stars if necessary. Maybe we can't control what's going on around us on Earth, but we can control things elsewhere. So we're envisioning Soviet cities on the moon and on other planets, so the Soviets are going to expand their power in that way. The Americans, though, refuse to back off. They keep launching spy planes over the Soviet Union. In 1960, we managed to finally shoot one of them down. A U-2 spy plane that was flying at very high altitude, we finally managed to shoot one down. The Americans had the gall to say that, no, it's not a spy plane. It was a weather balloon, or it was a scientific thing. But we had the wreckage. We were able to see what this thing was. We saw all the cameras. We saw all the weapons emplacements, which, on a U-2 there aren't many of them. But we could see that this was an American-made plane used for specific purposes. And we also had the pilot who had ejected after getting shot down. And the pilot, he was a member of the U.S. Air Force. And so we knew what was going on, and the Americans refused to admit to it. And so we keep getting this constant harassment from the United States and from Western Europe. And then the Americans start plowing money into the development of nuclear weapons, especially in the 1950s and 1960s. We see a massive expansion in the number of nuclear weapons. Now, all of these numbers are classified, but, we have a general sense of the numbers that the Americans are building weapons in. And so we launch a crash course too, because we have to keep up. If the Americans build these massive numbers of nuclear weapons, then they're going to be able to completely annihilate us if we can't keep up. And so we, in response, we also have to launch a nuclearization campaign where we start to build a massive number of weapons also. We're lagging behind the Americans, but it's a fairly fast that's a fairly sharp curve upward as we develop more and more weapons through the 1950s and 1960s. But again, our purpose is to keep up with the Americans, because the Americans are dangerous. And then the Americans start deploying some of those nuclear weapons to places like Turkey, right on our southern doorstep. Once the Americans have missiles in Turkey, they can easily take out most Soviet cities, at least in the western part of the Soviet Union. And that's not, you can't tolerate that. We cannot allow them to do that. They're already trying to encircle the Soviet Union. Now they're trying to fill that circle with nuclear weapons. We cannot allow that. And so we're going to start cultivating friendships around the world to try to push back on that encirclement. And one of the places will be in the country of Cuba. When Cuba was almost invaded by the United States at the Bay of Pigs in 1961, the Cubans reached out to the Soviet Union for assistance because even though that invasion was put down, it's probably going to happen again. The Americans don't like the Cubans, and so there's fear that it's going to happen again. And so we Soviets see this as kind of a no-brainer. Let's go help the Cubans. And while we're at it, we will also install some of our nuclear missiles. This is going to basically be tit for tat for the missiles that the U.S. is putting in places like Turkey. And so from the Soviet perspective, this is a no-brainer. We are helping to prevent one of our allies from being invaded, and we are also trying to send a message to the United States that they need to stop trying to encircle us and surround us with nuclear weapons. So this, from the Soviet perspective, this is a no-brainer. The American, and these missile sites that we build in Cuba give us much the same capability at striking American targets as those other missiles in Eastern Europe give the Americans for hitting Soviet targets. Now the Americans freak out. They start saying we all know the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so I'm not going to go into detail about that. But ultimately, we Soviets decide to back down. The agreement is that as long as the Americans promise not to invade Cuba anymore, we will remove the missiles from Cuba. Now, the secret part of that agreement is that the Americans also remove their missiles from Turkey. And so even though from the public perspective it looked like we backed down and that we blinked and that we probably got the short end of the deal, when in reality our security was improved because we did force the Americans to pull those missiles out of Turkey. So the missile crisis from the Soviet perspective wasn't a complete loss, even though part of it was done in secret. Now, we also decided to solve the Berlin problem by building that wall around West Berlin to separate West Berlin from the rest of Eastern Europe, because we were tired of seeing our people flee into West Berlin. So we built and so what started to develop was this bipolar world where the Western powers have their spheres of influence and we Soviets had our sphere of influence. And these spheres of influence kind of overlapped a lot here. And I'm not going to go into detail about all the various countries that are on this map, but as you can see, the balance of power is kind of leaning towards the Americans, which is a sign that there's some problems to come here. But for now, I mean, in the 40s, 50s, and even into the 1960s, there's this sense among the Soviets that maybe we can hold our own against the Americans. Khrushchev got booted out of power soon after the Cuban Missile Crisis because, again, it looked to a lot of the world like he had blinked and backed down. So he got booted out, and the new leader, Leonid Brezhnev, created a new doctrine for the Soviet Union where he's going to ramp up the missile production, ramp up the military, and ramp up military spending to try to keep up with the United States, with the Western powers. And so we have things like the May Day parade, which are here with all the missiles going through Red Square. Unfortunately, this is really, really expensive. And the Soviets don't really have the capability to absorb those expenses. And so the Brezhnev doctrine is not totally responsible for Soviet decay, but as you get into the late 60s, into the 70s, and into the 1980s, the Soviet Union is going to start to collapse. because it's not able to keep up with a lot of its obligations and the thing and promises that it had made. I've been talking before about how the Soviet Union was home to massive natural resources. There's huge agricultural tracts in the Soviet Union. The problem is being able to distribute it to the rest of the country. That became a problem, and it came to a head in the 1970s and the 1980s. The Soviet Union, the next couple of maps here are going to just show some of the various deposits that are available to the Soviet Union. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but we've got all these coal and mineral deposits. Here we've got all the agricultural, which is kind of the orange belt. Here is the grain, livestock. We've got more livestock, dairy, and meat. We've got huge swaths of agricultural land out there. But again, the problem is that there's very few railroads. There are very few roads connecting all these places together, so they're not able to distribute this stuff the way they need to. And in the 1970s, the Soviet Union actually has to start buying wheat from the United States. Now, if you're looking for a sign of Soviet decay, having to buy food from the enemy, it's a pretty big sign of Soviet decay. And so that doesn't really get played up all that often, but it's something, but it started in the 70s, and it's going to become a problem for the Soviet Union. They're just physically not able to feed themselves. This is petroleum deposits. There's huge oil deposits in the Soviet Union and in Russia, but again, they're just not able to exploit it very well. And so, because they can't distribute food very well, you start to see food lines, bread lines, you start to see rising levels of alcoholism, you start to see declining life expectancy, higher infant mortality, more domestic violence as people start to lose opportunities and as people go hungry. And so in the 70s and 80s, things are starting to come apart. Literally in some cases, like when the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl exploded and it melted down and exploded in 1986, rendering a huge chunk of the Ukraine unlivable for humanity for thousands of years. But that's not the only example of environmental degradation going on in the Soviet Union. There were massive Soviet lakes that became unable to support life by the 1980s because of high levels of pollution. All those factories that were being kind of thrown together were spewing all their pollution out into the waterways and all of that. And so there were massive water problems in the Soviet Union, which is further contributing to more health problems and just general decay for the nation. As I mentioned before, the Soviets and the Chinese didn't see communism the same way, and they actually started shooting at each other for a while. There was what became known as the Sino-Soviet split, where the two sides stopped talking to each other, which provided an opening for the United States in the 1970s. Richard Nixon going to China to reestablish diplomatic relations. That was done as a stick in the eye to the Soviet Union, because if the Americans can be friendly with the Chinese, then there goes that ally that the Soviets had been kind of counting on for so long. The invasion of Afghanistan turned into quite a fiasco also. The Soviets had been the Americans were struggling in the 70s also, as we talked about, and so the Soviets decided this would be our chance to go out, grab some new territory, and maybe even reach out and grab a port in southwestern Asia. Maybe grab a warm water port along the Black Sea or whatever. So we're going to, and so the Soviets decide to invade Afghanistan. The invasion basically consists of a grand tour of the highway system that existed in Afghanistan, rudimentary as it was. And so the Soviets kept control over this chunk of land for most of the 1980s. But that was pretty much it for their sphere of influence, was just along these roadways here. The rest of the country never fell to Soviet control. Part of that was because the Americans started flooding money into Afghanistan to get to the resistance leaders who fought against the Soviet invaders. And so the Soviets, the adventure in Afghanistan basically became the Soviet Union's version of what Vietnam was for the United States. It became an unwinnable conflict. Can't tell who's friend, who's enemy. You've got outsiders coming in and pouring in money, supplies, weapons, and the Soviets were unable to overcome that. And so in 1989, the Soviets were forced to withdraw from Afghanistan. So that foreign misadventure came to an end. But it's a sign of serious imperial decay because the Soviet military wasn't able to pull off the Afghanistan invasion at the same time that there's all those problems happening back home. Then there's also other examples. I mean, the Americans defeated a Cuban invasion in 1984, which was memorialized in the documentary known as Red Dawn. The puny American boxer Rocky Balboa defeated the Soviet Union's greatest boxer in 1986 in the documentary Rocky IV. And the Americans stole our most advanced submarine in the documentary The Hunt for Red October in 1990. So we are encountering setbacks all over the place, and it's just not looking good for the Soviet Union. Now, at the same time that things are starting to fall apart for the Soviet Union, the United States is beefing up its military exponentially. There's investment in all kinds of new weapon systems, stealth technology, stealth bombers, stealth fighters, new nuclear missiles, new subs, new bombers that are able to project force in a way that are even a more dangerous way than it happened in earlier generations. Some of these fighters don't show up on radar. We have no ability to stop some of these new weapons that the Americans are building, and so we're going to try. We're going to start investing in some new military, weapon systems of our own. But, Afghanistan is falling apart. We're not able to distribute food. We're just not going to be able to do that at the same level that the Americans can. The Americans are able to do this so well that they're even able to invest in completely nutball projects like the Strategic Defense Initiative, this complicated system where satellites are going to shoot down missiles and attack ground targets, which was utterly ridiculous. Everybody knew at the time that it's not going to work. The technological capability is just not there. It's not going to happen. But the Americans are throwing so much money at this military buildup that it doesn't even matter. The Americans have money to burn in the 1980s because their economy is booming at that point. The Americans have money to burn, and so they choose to burn a lot of it in the Strategic Defense Initiative, aka Star Wars. Nobody expected it to actually work, but the fact that the Americans can afford to throw money into that hole is an indication of just how strong the United States is and how weak the Soviet Union is, because the Soviets cannot possibly do the same thing. And so the Americans start ramping up their spending, their financial contributions, and the Soviets, we just cannot keep up. The Americans start doing nutball things just to antagonize us. In the early 80s, Operation Able Archer was a combined American-NATO naval operation, which they've been doing for a few years. But in 1983, they decided to add something new to the agenda, where they were going to bring in American military leaders and American political leaders like President Reagan to participate. Because the whole point of these exercises was to simulate an all-out world war between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so, in Operation Able Archer, the American military forces played war games off the coast of Europe in the North Sea and in the North Atlantic. Now, this came in the context of some rising tensions between the Americans and the Soviets in 1983. Just a couple of months earlier, the Soviet Union had been engaging in some war games of their own in their eastern territories, the island of Sakhalin and around there. They were practicing some missile tests, and they were testing out some new weapons. And the Americans kept flying spy planes over, and that was very, very frustrating for the Soviet Union. The Americans tended to do a strategy where they would send a fighter at the Soviet airspace, test where the radar would pick up the fighter, and then they would fly away and bounce off. And so for weeks, the Americans had been doing this, where they would come in and test the Soviet radar capabilities, and then would bounce off. And so the Soviets were very on edge. And then in the middle of all of that came a Korean airliner, a 747, came flying into Soviet airspace and did not bounce away when it hit the radar screen. The Soviets, who were at this point were a bit paranoid and a bit worked up about this, saw a plane which on the radar looked a lot like an American bomber continuing into Soviet airspace, refusing to acknowledge Soviet commands. Namely because the Korean Airlines plane was on a different frequency and was not receiving the messages that the Soviets were sending. Now, what had happened was the Korean airliner was supposed to be going to Korea. As you can see on this, it was supposed to be going on the dotted line here, but there was a problem with the autopilot. And so the 747 actually followed this path here, which took it off course and drifted into Soviet airspace. And when it did that, the Soviets mobilized some fighter jets to go intersect that plane to try to figure out what's going on. Those fighter pilots intersected the plane. The plane did not respond because it was on the wrong frequency. The plane started doing weird moves because the pilots on the plane started freaking out, realizing that, oh my God, we're off course and we're now in Soviet territory. And so the pilots decided to try to fly out of Soviet territory. And so they started to kind of veer off in a way that was slightly reminiscent of those other American jets that had been testing Soviet capabilities for a while. And so the Soviets decided to shoot it down, because they were tired of dealing with Americans. And so they shot the plane down. It took about 5 minutes for it to spiral into the ocean, and everybody died. And when that happened, that created a huge point of conflict for the Americans and for the Soviet Union, because the Soviets had just shot down a civilian 747. The Soviets, though, blamed the United States, saying that if you hadn't been doing all those tests before that and working us up into a frenzy, it would not have happened. So we're in that heightened state of tension when the Americans decide to launch Operation Able Archer 2 months later in November of '83, when suddenly the Americans are engaging in war games off of in the North Atlantic. And then, and we Soviets, we don't really know what's going on. They don't clear it with us. We just know that there's a whole lot of American and NATO ships coordinating off the coast of Europe. And then suddenly Ronald Reagan is scheduled to come on the line and give the actual order to attack the Soviet Union. And the Soviets start to freak out a little bit. And then in the middle of all of that, there's some more tensions because the Soviets installed a new missile defense radar system. And the the missile radar system didn't work very well. And so one day, suddenly, a nuclear missile popped up on a radar station in the Soviet Union. And the technicians at that radar station start freaking out because, oh boy, here it comes. The Americans, those nutball Americans have finally launched their first strike, and here it comes. And they start sending the messages up the chain of command. The chain of command starts mobilizing their they start priming a lot of their missiles to launch. They start getting their bombers up into the air. They start mobilizing their defense system because there's an American missile coming in towards the Soviet Union. After a few minutes, luckily, one of the technicians realizes that it's only one missile. Why would the Americans only launch one missile? If you're going to do a first strike, launch a bunch of missiles to just take out the entire country. Don't launch just one. So why is the American doing just one? That seems strange. And so luckily for the world, that technician and others started doing diagnostics. And they eventually figured out that, well, it was actually a flock of birds, not a missile that had spiked the radar. And so the Soviets breathe a sigh of relief. They start to, they call a bunch of the bombers back. They start, shutting down the missile systems. But then this keeps happening in different places around the Soviet Union because the system is just malfunctioning. So the Soviets are very on edge. And then the Americans start conducting these war games in 1983 in November. And the Soviet Union starts to think, the paranoia has built to the point where they start to think that this might be it. It doesn't. Eventually, an American spy in Moscow started to hear how freaked out the Soviets were. And so that spy actually got word to his handlers at the CIA saying, hey guys, stop what you're doing. The Soviets think this is true. They think this is real. You gotta stop. And so, thankfully, the American intelligence agencies stopped. They called off the Able Archer. They called off Reagan's participation in it. And so that it all calmed down. But that was the closest that the world came to war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We don't know about it as well because it hasn't been documented as much. There's still some classified documents about it. But it was the moment when the world almost ended, much like it was back during the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, and then there's also just other decay for the Soviet Union. The Eastern Europe is starting to fall apart. You start to see resistance movements. You start to see new political parties pop up who are advocating the withdrawal of Soviet control and the creation of self-determination in European countries. There's like the Solidarity movement in Poland. The Soviets start having to crack down on these independence movements and these democratic movements in Eastern Europe. And all of that starts to cost money at the same time that the Soviets are trying to pay for all those missiles, and at the same time that they can't distribute their own food to people. And so this is just all becoming kind of a bit of a snowball. Also in the 1980s, at the time when all of this is starting to become a crisis, there's this kind of period where there's a bunch of different leaders, but with the death of Konstantin Chernenko, who was the Soviet premier until 1985, when he died, we saw kind of a generational shift in the leadership of the Soviet Union. Up until 1985, all of the Soviet leadership had been people that had been around during the Russian Revolution. And so they were all revolutionaries. And so they were all kind of the fire-eating, hardcore revolutionaries. In 1985, though, we see a new guy come to power who is much younger than that other generation. Mikhail Gorbachev did not live through the Russian Revolution. He lived through the Great Patriotic War and everything that followed, but he didn't have the fire in his gut for the Bolshevik Revolution that a lot of his predecessors did. And so in the 1980s, he became much more open to reforms than his predecessors had. And so he engaged in these concepts, glasnost and perestroika, where we, the Soviet Union, are going to start opening up our political system. We're going to start opening up our economy a bit, because the communist economy isn't working so well. Remember all those potatoes in that thing that weren't being distributed. Remember all the oil that's not being distributed. The system isn't working. Let's start experimenting to we might have to bring in some capitalist ideas, but let's figure out a way to open up our economy that maybe it'll work better for everybody. And so you start to see things like McDonald's popping up in Moscow. I mean, you can't... The Cold War is pretty much over when you've got a McDonald's in Moscow. Gorbachev knows that we cannot afford to keep up with the Americans with all those new weapon systems, so let's start talking to the United States. And so Gorbachev and Reagan, American President Reagan, start holding these summit meetings where they start talking about how do we start to reduce the size of our nuclear capabilities? How do we alleviate tensions between the two sides? Now, the Soviets, Gorbachev wasn't able to do this on his own. He still had a military full of old guard type people who didn't want to see the country open up and all of that. That were kind of the fire-breathing Bolsheviks. They're still all over the place. But there's an incident in 1987 which allows Gorbachev to start to purge those people. And the incident was by a guy named Matthias Rusk, who was an East German citizen, or West German citizen, doesn't matter, he's a German citizen, who got himself a single-engine Piper Cub airplane and flew into the Soviet Union and landed in Red Square. Red Square was supposed to be one of the most secure plots of land in the world. I mean, it's like the White House in the United States. There's supposed to be no way that an attacker could possibly get to Red Square. And this guy flies a single-engine plane and just lands in the middle of Red Square. The Soviet military is totally embarrassed by this. Gorbachev uses that as a pretext for purging a whole bunch of military leaders because, wow, you guys are incompetent. You let this guy land on Red Square, so you're all fired. And so basically he fired all of the senior staff of the Soviet military who had been standing in the way of a lot of his reforms. And very soon thereafter, we see even bigger agreements with the United States to reduce nuclear weapons capabilities and all of that. And so Gorbachev is able to put in place a whole bunch of reforms that his predecessors never even tried. And once that happens, I mean, we're just starting to see this, the Soviet Union, once it starts opening up to capitalist ideas, once it starts reducing its military tensions with the West, the Soviet Union, there's not much left for this to unite the Soviet Union. And so fairly quickly, through all these various summit meetings and, oh, look, hey, look, who's that? It's Putin. Anyway, so there's all these with these summits that are happening, the Soviet Union is slowly kind of embracing new ideas, which is going to dilute the power of the Soviet ideology. And then when things start happening like tensions in Berlin, tensions with all those Eastern European dissidents, eventually it's going to reach a point where the Soviet Union just can no longer afford to pay for all the repression and to pay to prop up all those governments in Eastern Europe. And so in 1989, we see the fall of the Berlin Wall. The two Germanys come back together again because the Soviets pull out. Soviets start pulling out of other Eastern European countries because they simply cannot afford to prop up those governments anymore. And so once that happens, the Soviet Union is coming to an end because the Union is all of those satellite countries also. And once the Soviets start pulling out of some of its own component parts, then the Soviet Union no longer exists. And so from November of '89, when the Berlin Wall, which was kind of the most dramatic symbol of the divide between East and West, once that falls, it's going to be a very fast collapse from that point on. And so the Soviet structure in Eastern Europe will very quickly collapse, which will very quickly lead to a collapse in the Soviet Union itself. In 1991, or by 1991, the Soviets have lost control over everything in Eastern Europe. There's a last gasp of the old hardliners in August of 1991, where there's a brief coup against the Gorbachev government. Gorbachev was briefly detained and detained in a villa, but fairly soon thereafter. There was also the crumbling of Yugoslavia. I'm not even going to go into that here right now. We've been talking about this for a long time. Let's not worry about Yugoslavia right now. But in the Soviet Union, there was the coup in August of '91 brought the hardliners together for one last gasp at resurrecting the old Soviet Union. But it was not able to. But that group was not able to resist kind of the backlash and the counterattack by others in the Soviet Union who were looking for the openness, the glasnost, the perestroika that Gorbachev had advocated in the mid '80s. And so, that coup in 1991 kind of demonstrated that the Soviet Union is no longer much of a thing. The hardliners have been pretty much booted out of power at that point. The coup collapsed, and all those coup leaders were arrested, and none of them were allowed to hold positions of authority anymore. So the old Bolshevik generation has pretty much completely died out by that point. And the decay of the last couple of decades is starting to finally catch up to the Soviet Union, to the point where in 1991, the Soviet Union just ceased to exist. And instead of the old East versus West map of NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, we see instead that the Soviet Union is going to break apart into all of its various constituent parts. The Soviet Union was a union of 15 different countries, and those 15 countries then became their own independent nations in 1991, when the Soviet Union Parliament basically voted itself out of existence. And so from the American perspective and from the Soviet perspective, very different perspectives of the Cold War. The Americans didn't see it coming. The Soviets did. They saw it coming a long time. There's been decay and instability in the Soviet Union almost all along. And so this isn't really relevant to the Soviet Union. I apologize. Anyway, so the big picture that you want to keep in mind here is that the Soviet Union, their view of the Cold War was very different from the Americans. The Americans were dangerous from the Soviet perspective. They were bloodthirsty. They were racist. They were also very, very rich. And the Soviets just could not keep up with that. And so when you're thinking about the end of the Cold War, I want you to keep in mind the Soviet perspective, because the Americans contributed to the end of the Cold War by spending all that money on all those military systems and all of that, and by developing Star Wars and all of that. But the reality is that that was only a part of the reason for the collapse of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Another big part of it was just the long-running internal decay within the Soviet Union. So keep that in mind going forward. And hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions, and we will talk again sometime soon.